So I just mentioned in the video that I recorded 20 minutes ago, though it'll be at least 2 days before you see this one, that I wanted to make a video on why neoliberalism failed, which obviously that is presupposing that neoliberalism did fail, and it's also presupposing that we know what neoliberalism is, because you'll notice people who complain about neoliberalism generally don't have a good idea of what it is. And so this was not really a question that I thought to ask until I read this book. And the author of this book, who is not a fan of neoliberalism, he is much more pro New Deal liberalism. Still, as someone who stopped believing in New Deal liberalism when I was 16, I feel like his critique sort of had me starting asking the question, and I started seeing the answer. And so basically, Gergich describes essentially 3 phases of liberalism, of development of liberalism, which other writers might look at in other ways, but he's looking at specifically in terms of policy, because classical liberalism tended to be very laissez-faire, pro-free markets, although that was really the height of classical liberalism, and you can go back before then, which I might get into future video. And then you had what he calls social liberalism, which is like New Deal liberalism, and arguably social democracy as well, although social democracy, at least historically, framed itself as being working within the liberal system, but being anti-liberal. But either way, it's the idea that, okay, you have these market failures, and you'll meet a lot of libertarian types who will deny that market failures exist. At least one type of market failure clearly does exist, which is negative externalities. And so carbon pricing, the fact that we don't price that in, is a good, well-known example of this, right? Or if you're building like a tall building that's going to block the light to your neighbor, that is a negative externality to your neighbor. And there are a number of other cases of market failures. One that I will see defenders of laissez-faire argue about is the idea of natural monopolies. And I never got this until, I think it was Mentis Wave, but I don't remember which video, made a video explaining why believers in laissez-faire believe natural monopolies can't happen, in a way that I'm like, okay, I get the argument, I'm still not convinced, but the point is there are at least some things that we would consider market failures because the market is not pricing in other considerations that we might care about, or not working the way that defenders of laissez-faire, like starting with Adam Smith, might predict. So I want to acknowledge that at the very least, negative externalities are real. I have tended to think natural monopolies are too, although I would need to dig more into the literature on that. And I think if it was Mentis Wave, he mentioned Ludwig von Mises talked about that, but I'm not sure which book, but I want to dig into that at some point and get a better sense of his arguments. Regardless, markets do things that people don't like, and even things that might not be strictly market failures have consequences we don't like. Like, one of the reasons Marx was so impactful is because at the time he was writing, you had people working 12-plus hour days, 6 days a week in factories with terrible conditions, high risk, no social safety net. And even if that's not a market failure, that is still a pretty unpleasant situation to be in. And so you have the reformers come along and this idea of piecemeal social engineering, and let's do progressivism or social liberalism, New Deal liberalism. And you have these government policies that are meant to address these concerns. And what you quickly see are that you have failures of government. And in fact, I have said, because you'll see, if you read about the Free State Project, people love pointing to the Free State Project is a bunch of libertarians trying to move to New Hampshire and abolish government. And so one city they took over abolished animal control, and then they had a bear problem. And people love to point to that as this is a failure that's a market failure, that's a failure of libertarianism. And it's like, government failures are so common that they don't make the news. Like, libertarians take over a town in New Hampshire, do away with animal control, and you have a bear problem. That is a man bites dog story. Government failures are so ubiquitous that it's almost like water and people don't even notice them. And one of the most common that you see are regulatory capture. And I have actually written an essay because I have come to believe that basically all policy in practice is regulatory capture. It is protectionism that says one group of people gets to do something that previously everyone else got to do in order to advance the prestige and income of the protected group. And pretty much everything that these policies are supposed to protect, if you have a market and you have a functioning legal system, because the big concern would be fraud, and if you have either laws or courts to sue, like, aside from fraud, generally these things that the government is protecting you from take care of themselves, and you can find historic examples, but people are so used to it that they can't believe, I mean, how would it work without this? And so regulatory capture one of the biggest government failures, but there's others. And so then along come the neoliberals, and they say, okay, well, we recognize what social liberalism was trying to do, which is address these market failures, but it's creating these government failures. And so let's try to tailor like laser target solutions that will hopefully fix or nudge these market failures to be solved without heavy-handed government action. And Brian Kaplan it's downstairs, but in the book he did with the SMBC comics guy, Zach Wiener, Arguing for Open Borders, he talks about what he calls the keyhole principle, which is that laws should be extremely narrowly tailored to just address the problem in question. And so that sounds good. And you have policies like UBI, which I have previously supported and made a video on, that seem like they could work like this. And so what is the problem there? Well, we don't know if these policies work, because what happens is when politicians implement them, they still implement them in ways that twist them, distort them, to do away with what the point was. So I mentioned earlier that carbon pricing is a market failure because the externalities of carbon emissions are not paid by the people emitting. And so what you see is the solution to this, the keyhole solution, would be carbon taxation. And what you actually see is when countries have tried to address carbon emissions, they have always done cap and trade, which is basically it protects the incumbents in the industry, and it is a lot less flexible. It is all around a much worse solution. It's one that creates bureaucracy, but that's the point, protects the existing incumbents, and that's the point. And you see people will say, well, any carbon pricing is better. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm like, no. Carbon pricing, so cap and trade is not carbon pricing. Cap and trade is protectionism for established industries. And so this is just the kind of thing that you see come up again and again. And so basically, reading, I keep calling him Gergich, but it's actually Gersel. Sorry, I'm thinking of Parks and Rec guy, Larry, like he has a bunch of different names, Gergich. But anyways, Gary Gersel, he doesn't, because he is pro-New Deal, he doesn't really get this phenomenologically, but he does the way he describes it. I'm like, oh yeah, and one of the things that I realized is, as far as I know, Jimmy Carter is the only US president to seriously deregulate anything when he deregulated airlines and trucking. Everyone else, so Reagan, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, whenever they've claimed to deregulate anything, what they do is they create, essentially, I've joked about a Department of Deregulation, and then Elon Musk goes and makes the Department of Government Efficiency, bloated bureaucracy that accomplishes nothing. And I'm like, okay, like I was trying to be hyperbolic, and now you're actually seeing this. And so in practice, so I've talked about the elites and the counter-elites, and the counter-elites who supposedly are more laissez-faire pro-markets, they're really just pro-business interests of the people leading the counter-elites. And so they tend to pursue what I call counter-engineering, which is instead of just cutting regulations, as Carter did, they will try to regulate the regulators in ways that creates more red tape and more bureaucracy. And I think functionally that's the point. And so my answer, so what neoliberalism is it's the third iteration of liberalism that said, okay, we have the market failures of classical liberalism, we have the government failures of social liberalism, let's create these custom-made policies that laser-focus government action so that we hopefully have neither. And instead you get both. And one thing Gergich notes is no one has really had a new alternative. So when New Deal liberalism, when social liberalism failed, you had neoliberalism waiting in their wings, but no one has really been able to articulate an alternative. And I think that's because fundamentally you can't solve this on a policy level. Politicians are going to politician. They're going to make these policies that, given the chance, you're going to get the worst of both worlds. You're going to keep the market failures, but you're getting government failures on top of it. And so, again, I feel like the best solution is, I think eventually bureaucracy keeps growing and gets less efficient at enforcing its regulations, and eventually it's going to stop working. And you see this in the past where old laws sort of fell out. And so in the meantime, what we should be trying to do is build grassroots institutions that remain at a human scale and demonstrate that, yeah, we can do these things ourselves. Because once you get to the scale of mass institutions, it's not just government, it's any mass institution, I think, that has this problem. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.